So congratulations to everyone here for all your contributions to that. Today's webinar is focusing on the first of the independent evaluation studies from GEC II. We heard from the second one last week. We call them GEC, the first study and the second study, but that they happened simultaneously. This one is focused on access and learning, in particular in the context of COVID. And as we'll be hearing, was very much sort of trying to sort of learn from the experience of the implementing partners during this very challenging time. So we're going to be hearing from Maho and Sophie, who are going to be presenting to us the study, and they'll be presenting for about half an hour or so. So Maho and Sophie, maybe if you could introduce yourselves more fully when you start, and we'll then have time for some Q&A. As usual, please do put comments and questions in the chat as we go along, and we'll also draw on those, and you can also put your hand up when we come to the Q&A session. At the end of the webinar, we'll also hear briefly from Maho on an upcoming study that is focused on access and learning that is across the portfolio more generally and not specifically in relation to the COVID period, but you'll be hearing from Maho on that later. So Maho, let me hand over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, hello. I think you said we would introduce ourselves once we start. So my name is Maria Jose, so it's short for Maho. I am director of FABINC, and in this study, and in this independent evaluation, I'm the synthesis lead. So I've been leading part of the quantitative work across the studies. And I'll be presenting along with Sophie. We will be splitting the research questions, more relying on whether it's more qual or quant research oriented. So we can start with an introduction of the GEC. I think this is not new to anyone here in the call. So this slide just provides a snapshot of the Girls' Education Challenge, which was launched in 2012 by the FCDO to ensure that over 1 million of the most marginalized girls in the world complete a full cycle of education. There have been 2 phases, with phase 1 being completed and lasting from 2012 to 2017, funded by 37 research projects. Phase 2 of the GEC, which is currently ongoing, supports 41 projects in 17 countries throughout 2 windows. One is the GEC transition window, which supports 27 successful projects from the phase 1, as well as girls transitioning to the next phase of education. And the Leave No Girl Behind window, which supports 14 projects and adolescent girls who had either never attended school or have already dropped out of school. So the independent evaluation is conducted by a consortium of partners you've seen in the first slide. And it consists of a series of evaluation studies on different aspects of the GEC implementation and outcomes, with the intention to provide the FCDO as well as the IPs with formative evidence and learning to inform improvements to the design or the delivery of the overall portfolio. So this is the first study in this series, and it investigates the effects of COVID-19 on access and learning in the GEC II. And it was motivated by the questions of how much learning could be lost due to the unprecedented school closures, alongside concerns about the most marginalized girls failing to return to school after prolonged periods out of school. Next slide, please. So alongside these 2 research questions that I mentioned, the research study also considers related research questions. And this is to get a sense of what happened during the school closures, how projects reacted, but also to use the opportunity to test some new methodologies for predicting girls who are at risk of dropout. So specifically, the study answers the following 4 questions. How have projects sought to provide continued access to learning opportunities during school closures? How have girls' learning levels changed pre and post, so during the COVID-19 period? Which girls are more at risk of not returning to school, and how useful is a machine learning model approach in identifying them? And how are projects supporting girls to re-enter formal schooling or alternative pathways, and with what effects on girls' access to learning opportunities? So next slide, please. So we will be discussing each of the 4 questions in detail. So in terms of in terms of our study, overall, we reviewed project documentation to understand how all projects responded to the pandemic. But we also agreed with the FCDO to focus on 2 to 3 projects for our in-depth research to conduct primary research. And we focus on 2 to 3 given the difficulties of conducting primary research during the pandemic, and we will show the extent of the school closures and so on. And to enable as well to unpack girls' experience in depth through qualitative research. So the 2 projects in this research are Let Our Girls Succeed, implemented by EDT in Kenya, and supporting the education of marginalized girls in Kailali, implemented by Mercy Corps in Nepal. To select these 2 projects, we looked at 2 key factors, which was whether a project had been identified by the fund manager as having a system to monitor dropout, and whether it was expecting that we could estimate learning losses. So dropout and learning losses were the first 2 key criteria. And we shortlisted projects meeting those criteria, and then applied a 3rd criteria related to data availability. And we come up with this list with these 2 projects. There was a 3rd project that was also selected, Peace in Uganda, that was selected for the research, but given the repeated school closures and delaying in the school openings, it was withdrawn during the research process. Next slide, please. As we know, education systems around the world initially responded to the pandemic by shutting schools to keep children safe. So both countries, Kenya and Nepal, in the study experienced long school closures that you can see highlighted in red and also in yellow, with children out of school for many months. So in Kenya, schools reopened in mid-October, but only for those learning attending the examination, so the end of primary and secondary school examination. And for the rest of the studies of the students, schools reopened fully in January to start the 2nd term. So there was also a shift in school calendar years in Nepal and Kenya. In Nepal, schools closed in March as well and partially reopened around October, November, and fully open again in January 2021, January, February in 2021, but close again in April 21. So you can see that there in the year of 2021, there is a gap there, a green gap in 2000 where that schools were fully open. And this is when we managed to conduct our primary research for the Access and Learning study. So the next slide, what we have done now, we have 4 research questions as that I have named before, but this study uses a mixed methods approach. So we draw on primary and secondary data to answer research questions. And even though all the questions are interrelated in itself, the specific research methods vary considerably, research question by research questions. So we will be presenting the methods and the findings by research questions. And I'll hand over to Sophie, who will be talking about the first research question.
Thanks very much, Maho, and hi everyone. My name is Sophie Amelie, and I'm a senior consultant within Tetra Tech's evaluation and research team. And I'm the qualitative lead on the GEC independent evaluation and was the qualitative lead on the Access and Learning study. So as Maho mentioned, we'll present each research question in terms of the methods that we use to answer them, as well as the findings. So for the first research question, we really looked at how projects across the GEC portfolio plan to support girls with their learning while schools were closed. And to do this, we reviewed all of the available GEC project initial response plans, which were prepared at the onset of the pandemic, as well as their medium-term response plans, which really set out how projects were planning to support girls in the coming months and during the period of school closures. We also did a rapid review of the global evidence on access to education and learning in the context of COVID-19, because we wanted to be able to situate and contextualise our findings against the broader literature, against the broader evidence, to understand how they compared. For our selected projects, EDT in Kenya and Mercy Corps in Nepal, we did a deeper dive and we actually looked at how they actually supported girls during school closures and compare that with what they'd planned to do. And for these two projects, in addition to reviewing their response plans, we conducted key informant interviews with the implementing partners and the local partners to provide deeper insights into what they delivered and any challenges that they'd encountered in that process. Next slide, please. So what did we find? How did projects across the GEC plan to support girls? So across the portfolio, most of the projects plan to adapt their activities rather than starting or stopping interventions. So in terms of the new activities, the most common interventions that projects plan to introduce, as you can see here, were radio broadcasting. And around 84% of projects plan to do this. And this was closely followed by printing and distributing learning materials to girls' homes. And this was introduced by approximately 2/3 of all projects across the portfolio that had initial and medium-term response plans. Psychological support to girls was also really common, and around half of projects, planned to roll this out in some capacity. And that included things like drop-in visits to girls' houses or telephone calls to check in on their well-being while the schools were closed. And this was all very much in line with the wider evidence from other education systems around the world. And more than 90% of ministries of education around the world enacted some form of policy to provide digital and broadcast remote learning. So this is very much in line with the wider evidence. And the evidence also pointed to distributing learning materials, particularly for remote areas and remote households where connectivity is a real challenge. In terms of the activities that were stopped, projects frequently plan to stop teacher training and extracurricular activities such as girls' clubs, and those are possibly for obvious reasons due to mobility restrictions brought on as a result of COVID-19. Looking at EDT specifically, which was one of our two selected projects, they conducted home visits, they used digital platforms, radio and television broadcasts, they distributed solar radios, dignity kits, as well as cash transfers as well, all with the aim of supporting girls to continue in their education while schools were closed. And Mercy Corps, for their part, they delivered targeted support to girls due to sit their grade 10 examinations. And they also, just like EDT, they also supported with distributing informative posters, pamphlets, and public service announcements as well, using the radio to share information about COVID-19 while schools were closed. Next slide, please. Over to you, Maho.
Thank you. The second research question looks into how have girls' learning levels changed during the COVID-19 period. So here, to measure learning loss before and after the school closures, we compared reading and maths test scores for girls in February to March 2021, when we went out to do primary data collection, with scores collected in 2019 as part of the midline external evaluation. There were a series of tasks that we did to ensure comparability between these two time periods, and I'll be talking about those. So the first thing is we measured learning levels in the same schools where EDT and Mercy Corps collected data in 2019. So we took the sample where the data collected, the sample schools for the external evaluation, and we went to the same schools. These were all secondary schools, and we randomly sampled and assessed different girls in the same grades that they were assessed in 2019. So in the case of Kenya, this was Form 1 and Form 2 of secondary education, and in the case of Nepal, it was grades 9 and grade 10. As well as to maximize comparability between the two time periods, we also use the same tests that was administered during the midline evaluation. So we assessed different girls in the 2 time periods, but using the same test. And we also, our primary data collection was also timed to coincide with the second term of the school year. So even though we went in different months to do data collection, because of the disruptions around the school closures, the school calendar years had changed, and we timed this data collection to happen in the same term when they were initially assessed. So the main difference between girls in post-COVID period and the girls in the midline period is the actual hours of instruction they have received. Else everything else is more or less the same. We also spoke with girls of the same grades post-COVID to see how and why average learning levels in secondary schools changed. So we complemented our research, our quantitative research, with qualitative data to try and unpack and explain these changes. And then we spoke to girls, but also with parents and teachers. Next slide, please. So what were our findings? So we found that girls have suffered very large learning losses in both maths and reading in both countries. And this is statistically significant in both subjects in Kenya, in both Kenya and Nepal. But we also found that learning losses were uniform, and we found some schools experiencing some learning gains. When we asked girls and teachers and caregivers through qualitative research their perceptions of why their learning had changed and why this may have changed as a result of school closures, we found that girls encountered challenges in engaging in remote form of educations while schools were closed. Girls also spent less time studying at home and struggled with a lack of direct support and limited access to educational resources. So this isn't very new, and access to receiving and knowledge of the broadcasts, knowledge and awareness of broadcasts were also a barrier to learning. Motivation to study was also cited as negatively impact on girls the longer the schools were closed. So girls started to take on other responsibilities the longer the schools were closed, such as chores or work outside the household. And this affected particular girls most affected by the negative economic impact on households on household income as a result of GEC, which reduced the amount of time they spent on study. And next slide, please. Yeah. So moving on to the third research question. So we have talked about how projects responded to the pandemic. We have seen that there have been learning loss. The third research question was to try to understand which girls were at most risk of not returning to school and how useful is a machine learning approach in identifying them. For this research question, we developed a range of machine learning models to identify which girls might not return to school with the objective of improving targeting of responses in the future. Almost all machine learning problems will follow the same pipeline that is laid out in this and simplified in this slide. So there is a pre-step that involves processing the data. So in this study, we used semi-public data, the multiple indicators cluster survey, as well as the demographic health survey, the DHS, data to train the models. This is the box that you see in blue. And we combine it with project own monitoring data to create enrollment predictions for girls included in the dataset. And this is the box in orange. Because we need to train the models on the same variables that you will be later predicting on, variables between the training set, between the semi-public dataset, the DHS and the mix, had to be shared with datasets from project on monitoring data. So this was the step involving processing data. Once the data is ready, and we have the same variables in both datasets, we use the data. So we use the DHS and train the model for answering questions, which means predicting. So during the training, what happens is that we test various algorithms to determine the best performing one for predicting progression and dropout. And then we then predict girls who are likely to progress and those who are likely to drop out based on this girl's characteristics and project's own monitoring data. And to give an example of this is, if historically girls who repeated schools drop out a lot, and this was found during the training of the algorithm, then any girl who repeated a lot the grades in the project data then will be likely to be predicted as dropout. So once we have done the training, and the prediction, we evaluated the model. And we tested if these predictions were correct by visiting schools when they reopened in Kenya and Nepal and talking to girls and their teachers to find out why that was the case, whether we were correct or wrong. Next slide, please. So in this slide, we show the findings for our predictions and our validations. So first, our model predicted that girls were more at risk of dropout if they had already repeated a grade, came from less educated families, were part of larger households, and were involved in farming more than their peers or were married. When we went out, this was the results of our predictions. When we went out to the field to verify these predictions with the list of girls, we found out that 8.6% of girls did not return to school in Kenya, while 26.2% of girls did not return to school in Nepal. So our machine learning model was accurate in predicting enrollment and dropout in 65 to 80% of the cases. What does this mean in reality is that we had a list of girls, which we verified whether they had, which we had predicted whether they will be likely to be enrolled in school or drop out of school. And we verified and went out in the field to check if that particular girl was enrolled in school and was not enrolled in school. And then we checked the accuracy of that prediction, how many times we were correct and how many times we're wrong. So our machine learning model was accurate in predicting in 65 to 80% of the cases. In Kenya, our prediction was accurate for 8 out of 10 girls. Yeah. Sorry. And household poverty was the largest factor cited by girls in Kenya. They had dropped out of school.
Please, can you mute your microphone if you're not speaking?
Yeah. Thank you, sorry. So just going back, like to start with Kenya, our predictions in Kenya were accurate for 8 out of 10 girls in Kenya. And household poverty was cited as the largest factor for why girls had dropped out of school. And in Kenya, in Nepal, though, this dropped to 65% out of 10 girls. And the main reason for the lower performance when predicting dropout was that the demographic of these groups had shifted. So many girls who had been unmarried when the project data was collected and we used for predicting had then since married and dropped out. So we have seen in our predictions that marriage is a risk for dropout. So for these girls, the risk had been realized. So this suggests that predictive algorithms can be a useful tool for classifying girls who may be at risk of not progressing, in school, but also require faster learning loops to offer greater accuracy. So a future model that can capture learning from the set of predictions and can have information more in time around the risk of marriage, then will improve in accuracy. Overall, this is what we found, and we validated quantitatively, but we also spoke to girls as we were interested in why predictions were wrong, even why predictions were wrong. So girls' self-esteem, aspirations, and motivation to study were also cited to help return girls in their education, even when they were predicted to drop out. So when in our wrong predictions, when we predicted a girl to be enrolled and she was predicted to be out of school, we talked with them and we found out that these factors help them return to school. Next slide, please. I'll hand over to Sophie.
Thanks, Maho. So for our final research question, we looked at how selected projects, EDT and Mercy Corps, supported girls to re-enter schooling or alternative pathways, depending on whether they were supporting out-of-school girls or not, and the effects that those activities, those interventions that projects had on girls' access to learning opportunities and learning. So to do this, we reviewed the quarterly reports that EDT and Mercy Corps submitted between March 2020 and March 2021. And we also drew on the key informant interviews that we had with project implementing partners and their downstream partners, as well as the primary qualitative interviews, which Maho mentioned in relation to our second study question on learning loss. Next slide, please. So what we found was that, well, for EDT, they delivered a combination of the activities listed there to support girls' return to school. So a combination of back-to-school campaigns, community mobilisation activities, as well as cash transfers to around 500 households or so to re-engage girls in school and in their learning. Now, for Mercy Corps, they also supported girls through reopening or through enrolment drive, and they also supported school stakeholders with their school reopening plans, as well as broadcasting public service announcements to share information about the return to school. Both projects also supported girls to catch up with their learning, and also, in the case of Mercy Corps, to support them with their transition beyond school. In Kenya, EDT organised reading camps and they organised roving teachers as well. And they found, and they'd reported, that girls who attended out-of-hours reading camps had performed better in literacy and numeracy tests than those that didn't attend reading camps. So a really good start for the promise of reading camps in helping girls to catch up with their learning. In Nepal, Mercy Corps, as I mentioned, had been working with the girls due to sit their grade 10 examinations, and they supported these girls catch up with their learning through intensive classes in English, economics and mathematics, as well as delivering remedial learning as well to help girls catch up. Mercy Corps also delivered vocational training to help out-of-school girls with their technical and business management skills and help them really achieve financial independence. And as you can see listed there, 93% of those out-of-school girls had completed that training. In both Kenya and Nepal, head teachers all expressed confidence in girls being able to catch up on their lost learning, and very few teachers expressed any sort of concern on the impact that the lengthy school closures would have on girls, which is really, really encouraging. Over to you, Maho, for the next slide, please.
So just a couple of minutes left, but I think you're at the end. Thanks.
Yeah, great. So we are moving now to recommendations and what should projects take away from our research. So the first one is strengthening planning for future school closures. This is understandably IPs were asked to focus on immediate and short-term priorities when the pandemic started, but also as these pandemics will keep reiterating and school closures and so on, there should be include clear plans for longer term education delivery. So carefully considering where the learners are, what access they have to radios or to mobile phones, how it's best to engage them while schools are closed. The second one is around the pedagogy of radio learning lessons and reviewing the assumptions underpinning them. So, for example, if planning to use radio lessons, supplementing this with more interactive forms of learning were possible to engage girls. We found in our research that the one-way learning modality prevented girls from checking their understanding and grasping difficult concepts with their teachers, and this adversely impacted their ability to learn. So moving on to the next recommendation, carefully identifying, assessing and planning for the needs and barriers faced by different groups of learners means that there is not as one size fits for all approach, and we need to ensure that that learning is accessible to all types of learners, including those in rural and hard to reach areas. So for the most hard to reach areas, for example, interactive paper-based learning materials should be planned for and distributed as early as possible in response to school closures. Is one example of those. As well as this, we provide stronger support to teachers during school closures. We have had a second evaluation study looking at teaching, but across the portfolio, mainly we saw that very few projects plan to continue supporting or training teachers while schools were closed. So there's that recommendation. Then the next one is around data and systematically and regularly collecting and tracking girls' characteristics. This is very important because projects and schools' capacity to prevent girls from dropping out of school and mitigate barriers to learning is dependent on knowing which girls are most at risk. So systematic monitoring of those key indicators of girls are at risk and timely doing so will help prevent this. And for example, with those girls at risk of marriage, that we saw that their change in status was actually realized and then contributed strongly to dropout, perhaps would have been predicted if there's a reduction in household income and livelihoods due to income that push them to get married. So knowing this kind of data will help projects mitigate and create strategies to prevent this outcome from happening. And the final one is like about reassessing girls as soon as they come back to school to be able to do targeting support and understand who needs what. So our study finds that learning losses are not uniform across projects, so across schools in the project. So steps should be taken to understand the learning levels in which that they come back, and also for targeting for remedial support to help them catch up with their learning. And yep, over to Pauline, I think.
Thank you so much, Maho and Sophie. As you can tell, there's a huge amount of work that's gone into the report and a lot of different angles to digest. So I think Emma's maybe putting the links. I was going to say maybe just put the links in rather than embedded, because I think that may be causing a challenge. So the links are going into the chat here, so everybody should be able to access them. Thank you. And we have a couple of questions already coming in. And please do either put your question in the chat or also use the hand up function. So starting with Colin, a good question on whether there were any the difference between the reported learning gains and losses. What was the difference between those schools? Do we know why there were some schools that achieved learning gains? So Maho, and I should say there are other members of the team here, so if others want to come in as well, please do so. But I'll start with you, Maho, on that one.
Yeah, we did find like differences in the schools more in Kenya than in Nepal, and these were due to I think when we look at learning gains in those schools that they had experienced learning gains, girls were able to study more frequently. So that was one of the aspects that was correlated with that. I'm not sure. I think that was, yeah, one of the ones that we were looking at.
So just while we're on that, there was also another question on how you're defining learning loss. So how you measured learning loss. What was the sort of benchmark against which you were? Yeah,
so for learning loss, simply we're like doing a straightforward comparison, across cohort comparison between midline, the level at midline, and the level at after COVID-19. So we compare the scores of different girls, but that were attending the same grades in the same terms, and that were assessed using the same test. So what we just do is a straight comparison, a difference in the two data points.
Yeah, and Maho, just to jump in there, we also have for some girls in Nepal, we managed to find the same girls, so we give them the same test as before, so we can see for a smaller group of girls, I think it was about 115, how much they've forgotten during the period. So the main bulk of the results are the average class level learning changes between two cohorts, but for a smaller group we have specific information on how much the girls have forgotten, so specific content.
Thanks both. So Colin and Mary-Louise, I hope that responds to your question, but if not, please do come back. There's also a question.
I do just want to ask about
Sure.
the definition. So I appreciate Paul's addition of the forgotten bit. But certainly, hi, my name is Mary-Louise and I work as part of the fund manager. Within the fund manager, we have really tried to kind of ascertain the degree to which things have actually been lost. So yes, there hasn't been an opportunity to learn, but once a girl has learned something, it's not necessarily gone forever. And especially given your comments around how teachers seemed relatively optimistic about the degree to which they could catch up again. So I wanted to understand that ontological difference between loss and presence and gain, as it were. But forgotten seems to be one aspect of it. Anything else you could add to that?
No, I think that's all we can really say, because it comes down to the kind of how much you can conclude from repeated cross sections at a kind of average level. So we can say that, you know, the girls are performing at a lower level than their comparator peers a few years ago, but it's only for this small subgroup in Nepal where we can actually say they've lost learning, as in they had it previously. So we don't know if other things have happened, which could have been another shock, because all we can do is compare before and after, controlling for certain characteristics as well. So, you know, we can control for some household level factors. Maho can tell you in more detail. But yes, you are right. Like we are limited certainly in Kenya in how much we can speak. And I should say that when we work with the EDT team in the primary school, they certainly didn't find this average learning fall overall. They found it in some pockets from what I can recall. But yeah, that's all we can say, I think. Maho, Sophie?
Yeah, I think that's all we can say. I think the other aspect that I will want to say about the learning loss and the learning school gains is that we did also find that schools that reported learning gains on average had a wider range of support to their students. So they allow access to the school library, or they allowed parents to pick up the textbooks and the reading materials, and also they visited students in their homes. So there was like some findings around that as well that explained the learning gains. Just wanted to comment on that.
Thanks, Maho. And I think that aligns with, Sophie, what you've put in the chat in terms of the qualitative. Is there anything you wanted to add on that, Sophie, for the qualitative?
No, I think you've covered it. There was the only additional point was in the qualitative interviews as well. Those reporting having a sibling at home to be able to get informal help from was also mentioned by girls, in addition to, you know, the paper-based materials and really having that dedicated time to study. Those were the factors that were highlighted as helping girls to gain learning during the school closures.
Thank you. I think this is sort of quite an interesting feature of the report, isn't it? The sort of differentiation between those different, that it's not only learning losses that were experienced. There's a question from Kate on the machine learning. How did the machine learning predictions compare with the predictions of the project staff about the girls who are most likely to drop out?
I can answer that. I don't think there were predictions made on this by the projects as soon as they came back. So what we had done is we used the project's monitoring data that they had collected before that, and then we, as soon as the schools opened, which is when we went out in the field, we collected this data. So we were also the first ones to, in parallel to the projects, to go in and collect this data. So we did not compare against who they were targeting.
Yeah, so we can't compare for the specific girl. We have predictions for each individual girl. We didn't do a process of, although it would have been fascinating, of saying to the district and local staff, you know, what's your views on this girl? Like it would be challenging to do, and also data protection stuff as well. I think if we step back a little bit, the characteristics were not surprising. I don't think anyone was surprised by the characteristics of dropout. I think the magnitude and the importance of early marriage, certainly in Nepal, was not a surprise to anyone. That came through in the qual work as well. And I think one of the big advantages of our study is the qual-quant kind of nexus, basically trying to unpack some of that. But I don't think in terms of the predictive characteristics, we were really surprised. I don't think anybody was. But yeah, we didn't compare and contrast on a specific level. We are actually speaking with EDT just in terms of the pre-existing model, which took into account attendance during previous schooling and such. Obviously, that model kind of fell apart a little bit when you moved to school closures, because a lot of the kind of predictions, if you will, or the information sources was, are girls attending? And if they're not attending school or they're not attending the clubs which are being run, then that's seen as a flag for a lot of the risk. But if those aren't being run because of school closures, then you don't have a risk monitoring system. So we're discussing with them, basically, now things are back up and running, how we can expand on some of this work as well.
Yeah, and I think some of the expansions that like we are in discussions in general is also like understanding teachers' predictions and comparisons around that as well. It will be ideal to do future research, you know, like how like teachers have a wealth of knowledge of the students. So if they predict or if they sense that someone is at risk, how does that then goes? But of course, this involves data collection cycles to understand and train on those predictions, see how they fared in with time, and then test them back again.
Thanks. I can see there's another couple of questions, but I think, Daniel, you were also responding in part to this. Would you mind just coming in and maybe, so I think you're sort of talking about it from the project perspective of some data that you've got?
Sorry?
Daniel, if you're able to, are you able to unmute, Daniel? If not, so Daniel has put a comment that the dropout predictions from the project stood at 9.8% during the same period when we conducted the rapid assessment study in February 2021, and from the attendance data. Sorry, I'm not sure which of the projects that is referring to. So
it's EDT.
EDT. Okay.
If Daniel, do you want to come and talk about the
All right, thanks so much. Thanks, Maho and Amelie and Paul and Pauline. This is from the GEC II Education Development Trust project in Kenya. And around the same time, we worked very closely with the external evaluator in all this. And during that period, we had our attendance data analyzed, and we also did our rapid assessment study during that period just to assess the loss of learning. But I think for us, we were just following up on our cohort girls. So our prediction from those two sources stood at 9.8% dropout rates for our girls. So that's why we didn't have a significant loss in terms of learners and learning.
Yeah. Thank you. And just to clarify as well, that is we focus because EDT was focused on primary schools and doing this rapid assessment for learning loss. We then focused as well in secondary schools. So we complemented the research and we went out in the field at more or less at the same time.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Daniel, for that insight as well. So another couple of questions. There's one for Marie on whether were girls with disabilities included in the study?
Yeah, so these projects do target girls with disability, but we were not specifically tracking for girls, whether they were disabled or not. We selected a girl, we randomly chose girls, and we also work with girls that were part of, for the learning loss, we randomly sampled girls in Form 1 and Form 2. So if there were disabled girls in the schools and they happen to be chosen, then they will be selected. But we were not tracking an indicator of whether they are disabled or not. And for the predictions school, this can definitely be looked into. We work with project monitoring data as well, so girls that projects work with for doing the predictions. So this is one of the features and the variables that was included into the predictions, and will have been taken into account to running these predictions. So while we didn't verify if girls, like obviously the predictions use a wealth of data and use patterns and so on. So if disability is a high risk factor, then girls that are disabled will be more likely to be predicted a dropout. So we didn't confirm that against a specific characteristic. We just confirmed the overall status of the accuracy of the overall prediction. But it was indeed used as a predictor factor.
Thanks, Maho. So there's a comment or question from Michael about the teacher support and whether there was any evidence of stronger teacher support and linked with the interventions. I don't think this was a focus of this study, but colleagues here can correct me. Last week we presented on the other independent evaluation study that has been undertaken and recently published that focused on teachers and teaching and identified the different forms of support to teachers during the COVID period. So I don't know if Sophie or Louise, you've got the links to that handy. If you might put that in the chat, that would be helpful. But I don't know if any colleagues want to come in on how the role of teachers came up in this study, if it did.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in and share some thoughts, some insights from the report. So thank you for your question, Michael. I think this relates to one of our recommendations around the need to strengthen support to teachers, particularly in times of remote learning crises. And one of the things we picked up in the study is, around a fifth of projects stopped their interventions with teachers at the onset of the pandemic. So things like teacher training, for example, was stopped. Skills training for teachers was stopped quite commonly across the portfolio. And I think one of the things we picked up, certainly in the qual, is that students really struggled. Girls really struggled in being able to check understanding, particularly when there were more difficult concepts that they were struggling to grasp, without having a teacher they can, ask follow-up questions with and check their understanding. So even when there was sort of a WhatsApp group in place, or when teachers were phoning girls, there wasn't really an opportunity for the sort of to and fro that you might get within a classroom setting. And added to that, girls were, of course, removed as well from their peers who they could learn from, even in an informal capacity, and had to really rely on any support that their parents or caregivers were able to give them, on top of everything else that, of course, parents and caregivers were dealing with during the crisis. So,
thanks, Sophie. I'm just going to have to cut us short. So if you just say one more sentence, because we've got to move on. Thanks.
Sure. So I think in terms of how projects could support teachers going forward in terms of future crises, I think helping teachers, equip them with the skills to deliver remote learning, how to check for signs that girls are struggling with their education, how to motivate girls remotely as well, which again we mentioned is one of the biggest things that we found in the study. So those three things would be really useful in terms of strengthening support to teachers to equip them to deal with future school closures. Thanks.
Thanks, Sophie. I'm going to move us on to the last part of the agenda, and there's a a question from Lucy on evidence of teachers leaving the profession. That wasn't actually a focus of this report, so I'm afraid I don't think we would have much evidence on that. But good question, and I think there are some other studies, including something we've been doing in Rwanda, that found that they didn't leave as much as we might have anticipated. But another important thing to monitor in different contexts. So Maho, back over to you to just give an overview of an upcoming one of the upcoming studies. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. So as I introduced at the beginning, the independent evaluation is a series of studies that we have done. So the first two studies, the access and learning and the teachers and teaching, have been more research oriented in nature. But the GEC II evaluation study 3 will look at quantitatively assessing the aggregate impact of the GEC project on learning between baseline and midline. We can go to the next slide. So the aims and objectives, the purpose of this study is using the baseline and midline data gathered by the external evaluators to conduct research on to the extent to which the GEC project as a whole have been successful or not in improving learning outcomes of target girls between baseline and midline. So we're not aiming here to replicate what the external evaluations have done specifically for each project. What we are looking at is like to putting together all the data, all the wealth of data that has been collected in baseline and midline by different projects, and look at the overall success over and above the comparison groups. We will also look at the extent to which changes in learning outcomes vary across contexts and subgroups, as well as girls and household characteristics. And we will be looking at statistical correlations between changes in learning outcomes and potential predictions of learning, among a list of characteristics and potential barriers. So we will be using statistical correlation and regression analysis for doing so. Next slide, please. So talking a little bit about the approach and the timeframes of this study, it's the following. So the first approach and the first step into this is creating a baseline and midline combined data set at the portfolio level for analysis. Then this will be followed by analysis of the learning outcomes, analysis of transition outcomes, and reporting phase. So we are currently in phase 1 of this study. So we have completed a scoping of the data set, and this study builds up on a previous study that had been being conducted by OPM, whereby there had been a reanalysis of the baseline data, and all the project data at baseline had been put together by the OPM team. So what we're doing in this study, building from that and taking the same approach at midline to create a unique data set at midline, and then combine that with the baseline data set, so that we can have a combined data set between baseline and midline. So we have scoped the data, and then the next step is the creation of a unique midline data set, which is where we're working on it now, and preparing this baseline data set for appendix and analysis. So there will be some work that we also have to do in the previous data set that we inherited from that research to prepare it, to combine it with the midline. And then we will create a harmonized learning composite and subtask score. So we will be looking at learning differences, and we will be looking at a composite learning score that it will be looking across all subtasks, but we will also try and look at comparison by subtask, so that we can do some comparisons by skill levels, and subtasks will range from, subtraction, subtraction and additions, and then going upwards to more complex skills in maths, and the same way for reading, so from letter identification then up to oral reading fluency. So we will be doing that, and then once we have the data set together, sorry, my
Maho seems to have frozen. Do other colleagues know, is this the last slide?
Yes, it
Yes,
is.
I think it's the last slide, and yes, Maho has frozen on my side too.
Yeah,
I can
she's
see
gone.
Paul and Simon have both come on. Would one of you be able to just finish off?
Apologies. I think my computer went to sleep.
Okay, there we go.
Sorry.
You might want to switch your camera off, Maho, because I think your camera's frozen.
Okay. Apologies about that. My computer just decided to went to sleep without telling me. Yeah. So we're in the process of creating this data set. I must say that creating this baseline and midline data set and combining the whole data sets from the portfolio, it's the biggest task. It's what it takes, more time to homogenize all the variables. But after that, we will be following in April to analysis of the learning outcomes. So we will be doing descriptive statistics of the baseline and midline learning levels by subgroups and regions to see where they were, and then compare the baseline to the midline learning scores to assess the progress between both time periods, as well as regression analysis and predictions of learning. There will be also another piece of research that will involve the transition outcomes, and for transition outcomes, we will be focusing first on grade repetition as an unsuccessful transition, which is how projects define it. And then we will be also potentially comparing attrition as an unsuccessful transition, and this will be discussed as well with the team and so on. As like the majority of the girls that end up dropping out or not being able to be recontacted at midline is because they follow an unsuccessful transition. So what we aim to do is also comparing just the level of attrition in project schools and comparison schools with the intention to hypothesize that the attrition will be lower in project schools and in comparison schools. So that's on the side of the transition outcomes. And then there will be a reporting phase. So we will be producing preliminary findings around the end on April, and we will be sharing those for discussion before we start the writing up of our report in May.
Great, thank you, Maho. So again, you can see sort of a lot of activity going on. This is being done in close collaboration with a funder manager to make sure there's synergies and not overlap with any of the work that's being done. And this is perhaps more of a sort of what one sees as more conventional portfolio analysis. Simon, were you wanting to come in? We've just got a minute or two left.
No, there's
okay. I just saw you there on the screen. so you'll obviously be hearing more about this as the work progresses, and hopefully you can now access the links. I think the fund manager is going to hopefully be finding a space on the website where the independent evaluation reports are in one place. So thank you again to Maho and Sophie for the presentations and for all the team for your work on the report, as well as to all of you for listening and for your contributions, and particularly to those partners, implementing partners who've been very engaged. We know that it's quite an intense process and we really value that engagement throughout. Just one final thing, again, going back to saying Happy International Women's Day to everybody. I just happened to notice that there is the UK government has just announced a new global business partnership that, if you're not aware of and might be interested in reading the press release, colleagues from FCDO no doubt know more. I think it's quite interesting to see the focus on the private sector and probably some lessons from GEC I that could be learnt on the engagement of the private sector in girls' education. So I think we'd all be happy to discuss that further with you all. And so on that note, thank you again and have a good rest of the day and enjoy your International Women's Day.
Thanks all.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.